Some houses keep secrets buried so deep they become part of the foundation. The Alcott Mansion in Maplewood, Vermont was one of those houses. For 3 years, Mary Beth Collins cleaned its floors, dusted its furniture, and carefully avoided the one room she was forbidden to enter. She was a widow living in a trailer, barely surviving on minimum wage, still grieving the son who vanished 5 years ago without a trace. She needed this job. She needed to keep her head down. She needed to stop asking questions that no one wanted to answer. But on one frozen December morning, a drawer opened that should have stayed closed forever. Inside, Mary Beth found letters, dozens of them, written in a dying man's desperate handwriting. Every single one addressed to her missing son. In that moment, everything she thought she knew about the night Samuel disappeared shattered like glass. Because the millionaire slowly dying upstairs wasn't just sick. He was being consumed by a guilt so powerful it was killing him from the inside out. And the nurse who controlled his every breath, his every word, his every moment of consciousness, was hiding a truth so devastating it would destroy everyone it touched. What Mary Beth discovered in that mansion would lead her on a journey across the country, through layers of lies and impossible choices, to a reunion that seemed like a miracle but felt like a wound that would never fully heal. This is a story about the secrets we keep to protect the people we love, about the price of truth when the cost is measured in years of stolen life, and about a mother who refused to stop searching even when the entire world told her to let go. Because some truths arrive too late to save everyone. But they're never too late for those still breathing. If you want to know what really happens when the past refuses to stay buried, make sure to follow this channel, leave a like, and comment below telling us where you're watching from. This story will stay with you long after it ends. The cold bit harder than usual that December morning in Maplewood, Vermont. At 5:47 a.m., when most of the town still slept beneath quilts and the comfort of ignorance, Mary Beth Collins was already walking up the snow-dusted driveway of the Alcott Mansion, her worn boots crunching against the ice with a rhythm she'd memorized over 3 years of early arrivals. Her breath came out in small clouds that disappeared into the darkness, much like her son had disappeared 5 years ago, completely without warning, without mercy. She was 55 but looked older. Grief does that. It carves lines where laughter should have lived. Her hands, red and chapped from years of cleaning other people's homes, trembled slightly as she fumbled with the key to the service entrance. Not from the cold. Never just from the cold. Mary Beth's hands had trembled every morning since the day Sheriff Morrison knocked on her trailer door and told her Samuel was gone. Missing. Vanished on Lumberjack Road during a storm that seemed to erase him from existence. But this morning, something felt different. Wrong. The window on the second floor, Henry Alcott's bedroom window, was open. Not just cracked. Wide open. The white curtains billowed out like ghosts trying to escape, flapping violently in the pre-dawn wind. Mary Beth stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, her heart suddenly loud in her ears. Mr. Alcott never opened that window. Never. He was too sick, too weak, too consumed by whatever illness had been eating him alive for the past 2 years. The doctors called it a mystery. The town called it karma. She climbed the steps slowly, each one creaking under her weight, announcing her arrival to a house that seemed to be watching her. The front door was unlocked, another oddity. Mrs. Chun, the housekeeper who worked the day shift, was meticulous about locking everything. Mary Beth pushed it open, and the smell hit her immediately. Antiseptic, decay, and something else. Something that reminded her of hospital rooms and final goodbyes. "Mr. Alcott?" Her voice barely carried through the foyer. The chandelier above cast fractured light across the marble floor, creating shadows that seemed to move when she wasn't looking directly at them. No answer. Just the distant hum of the furnace and the whistle of wind through that open window upstairs. Mary Beth's job was simple. Clean the first floor before dawn, avoid the private quarters, never touch Mr. Alcott's study. She'd been doing this for 3 years, ever since her husband died and left her with nothing but a rusted trailer and medical bills that multiplied like weeds. The pay was good, suspiciously good for cleaning work, but she never questioned it. She needed it too desperately to ask why a dying millionaire wanted his floors scrubbed before sunrise. She set down her supply bucket in the kitchen and began with the counters, working mechanically, trying to ignore the unease crawling up her spine. But her eyes kept drifting toward the study door. It was slightly ajar. In 3 years, she'd never seen it open. Not once. Mary Beth knew she should walk away, mind her business, do her job. But something pulled at her, a magnetic, terrible curiosity that felt almost like a voice calling her name. She approached the door, her heartbeat now a drum, her palms sweating despite the cold. She pushed it open slowly, wincing at the creak of old hinges. The study was exactly as she'd imagined, dark wood, expensive and cold. Leather-bound books lined the walls, their spines uncracked, more decoration than literature. A massive oak desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with papers, prescription bottles, and a lamp that cast a sickly yellow glow. But what caught her attention was the antique secretary desk against the far wall. The one Mrs. Chun had mentioned in passing, the one Mr. Alcott forbade anyone from touching. Mary Beth stepped inside, her conscience screaming at her to leave, but her feet moving forward anyway. She picked up her dust cloth, telling herself she was just doing her job. Just cleaning. Nothing wrong with that. She reached for the desk, began wiping the surface, when her cloth caught on something. A small drawer handle, barely visible, carved into the wood grain so cleverly it was almost invisible. She should have stopped. God, she should have stopped. But she pulled. The drawer resisted at first, then gave way with a soft click that sounded like a bone breaking in the silence. Inside was another drawer, smaller, hidden. A secret within a secret. And inside that letters. Dozens of them. Yellowed with age, tied with string that had frayed from repeated handling. The handwriting on the envelopes was shaky, desperate, the ink smudged in places as if tears had fallen while the addresses were being written. Mary Beth's vision blurred. Her hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the stack. Because every single envelope was addressed to the same person. Samuel Collins. Her Samuel. Her son. The son who'd been missing for 5 years. The son the police stopped looking for after 6 months. The son whose bedroom in her trailer she still kept exactly as he'd left it, his Celtics poster on the wall, his Xbox controller on the nightstand, his last text message to her still saved in her phone. Working late at the garage, Mom. Love you. The room tilted. Mary Beth grabbed the edge of the desk to steady herself, her breath coming in short, painful gasps. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. Henry Alcott, the millionaire who owned half the businesses in town, who'd lived in his mansion like a ghost for the past 2 years. Why did he have letters addressed to her dead son? How did he even know Samuel's name? With trembling fingers, she pulled the first letter from the stack. The envelope was unsealed, as if someone had opened it, read it, then given up on sending it. The paper inside was brittle, covered in that same shaking handwriting. She unfolded it slowly, afraid it might disintegrate in her hands. The date at the top read November 18th, 2020, just 3 weeks after Samuel disappeared. The first line made her knees buckle. I need to confess the truth before my body gives out completely. The words swam before her eyes. Confess what? What truth? Mary Beth's mind raced through possibilities, each one more horrifying than the last. She had to read more. She had to know. Her hands moved to unfold the letter further when, slam, the study door shut behind her with such force that books fell from the shelves. Mary Beth spun around, her heart exploding in her chest, the letter falling from her hands and drifting to the floor like a dying bird. The door was closed, completely closed, but she was alone. Wasn't she? Hello? Her voice cracked, barely a whisper. Is someone there? Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. But she could feel it, the distinct sensation of being watched. Of something in that room with her, invisible but present, angry that she'd found what she'd found. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Her breath became visible in small, panicked puffs. Mary Beth's survival instinct screamed at her to run, but she couldn't move. Her eyes were locked on the letter on the floor, on those words, I need to confess the truth. She bent down, snatched it up, and shoved it into the pocket of her uniform, her hands barely cooperating. The other letters she left in the drawer, too afraid to take them all, too terrified to stay a second longer. She backed toward the door, her eyes scanning the room for whatever had closed it. Nothing. Just shadows and the accusatory stare of that open drawer. She grabbed the handle, twisted it. It was stuck. Locked. Panic flooded her system. She twisted harder, put her weight into it, and finally, mercifully, it gave way. Mary Beth burst into the hallway, gasping, her whole body shaking. The house felt different now. Malevolent. Like it knew she'd crossed a line. Like it knew she'd taken something that didn't belong to her. She pressed her back against the wall, trying to calm her racing heart, trying to make sense of what had just happened. That's when she heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from upstairs. From Mr. Alcott's room. But Mr. Alcott couldn't walk. He'd been bedridden for months. So who or what was walking around up there? Mary Beth looked down at her pocket, at the outline of the letter pressed against the fabric. Every instinct told her to run, to leave this house and never come back. But she couldn't. Not now. Not when she finally had a clue. Any clue about what happened to her son. She took a deep breath, steadied herself, and started toward the stairs. Whatever was in this house, whatever secrets these walls held, she would face them. Because somewhere in this mansion of lies and death, there were answers. And Mary Beth Collins had waited 5 years to find them. Even if it killed her. The stairs groaned under Mary Beth's weight as she climbed toward the second floor, each step a small betrayal announcing her presence to whatever waited above. Her right hand gripped the banister so tightly her knuckles had gone white, bloodless. Her left hand pressed against the pocket of her uniform, feeling the sharp corners of the folded letter. Proof that she hadn't imagined it. Proof that her son's name existed somewhere in this house of secrets. The footsteps she'd heard had stopped, replaced now by a silence so complete it felt alive, breathing, waiting. At the top of the landing, Mary Beth paused. The hallway stretched before her like a throat, dark except for the thin line of gray dawn light seeping through that still open window at the far end. Mr. Alcott's bedroom door stood partially ajar, and from within came the sound she'd grown accustomed to over 3 years. The labored, wet breathing of a dying man. But there was something else now. A presence, a thickness to the air that made her skin prickle with warning. She approached slowly, her cleaning uniform rustling softly, the sound absurdly loud in the oppressive quiet. Through the crack in the door, she could see a slice of the room. The oxygen tank with its clear tubes snaking across expensive carpet, the four-stand with its bag of fluid catching the dim light, and the massive four-poster bed where Henry Alcott lay dying by inches. Mary Beth pushed the door open wider, and it swung on well-oiled hinges, silent, smooth, like the house itself was holding its breath. The bedroom was enormous, bigger than her entire trailer, decorated in dark greens and burgundy that absorbed light rather than reflected it. Heavy drapes covered most of the windows except that one, the Rebel, still open and allowing cold December air to flood the room. It should have been freezing, but somehow it felt suffocating, thick with the smell of medication and something else, decay yes, but also fear. Old, concentrated fear that had seeped into the wallpaper and floorboards. Henry Alcott lay in the center of the bed, propped up on pillows, his body so thin the blankets barely rose over his frame. He'd been a large man once. Mary Beth had seen photos in the hallway, pictures of a robust figure at ribbon-cutting ceremonies, shaking hands with mayors and senators. That man was gone. What remained was a skeleton wrapped in papery skin, yellow-tinged and translucent, stretched so tight over his skull that every bone was visible. His eyes were closed, but his chest rose and fell in that terrible rhythm. 3 shallow breaths, then a long pause where death seemed to consider claiming him, then 3 more breaths, like his body couldn't decide whether to fight or surrender. She started to back out of the room, thinking perhaps she'd been wrong about the footsteps. Perhaps the house was just old and settling. Perhaps her panic had made her hear things that weren't there. But then his eyes opened. Not slowly, not groggily. They snapped open with terrifying alertness, fixing on her immediately, as if he'd been awake the entire time, waiting for her to appear. His eyes were blue, a blue so pale it was almost white, like ice over deep water, and they held an expression Mary Beth couldn't quite decipher. Fear? Guilt? Recognition? All 3 seemed to swirl in those faded irises, creating a cocktail of emotion that made her breath catch. "Mr. Alcott," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I heard. I thought I heard." He didn't respond, didn't blink, just stared at her with those unsettling eyes, his gaze dropping slowly, deliberately to her left hand, still pressed against her pocket, still protecting that letter. The air in the room seemed to crystallize, to become solid with tension. He knew. Somehow, impossibly, he knew what she'd found. Mary Beth's first instinct was to run. Her second was to demand answers, to pull the letter from her pocket and shove it in his face, to scream at this dying man until he told her everything. But she did neither. Instead, she stood frozen, pinned by his gaze like an insect on display, while her mind raced through implications she wasn't ready to face. I should close that window," she finally said, moving toward it on legs that felt disconnected from her body. The physical action gave her something to do, somewhere to look besides those accusing eyes. She reached for the window frame, her fingers fumbling with the old wood, and as she pulled it shut, she caught sight of something that made her stomach lurch. On the windowsill, barely visible in the dim light, were scratches. Deep ones. Deliberate. Like someone, or something, had been trying to get in. Or out. She slammed the window shut harder than she'd intended, and the sound made her jump. When she turned back to the room, Henry Alcott was still watching her, but now there was something else in his expression. Desperation, maybe. Or warning. His mouth opened slightly, as if he was trying to speak, but only a wheezing sound emerged, followed by a cough that shook his entire frame. Mary Beth approached the bed, her training as a caregiver overriding her fear. She adjusted his pillows, checked the oxygen tube to make sure it hadn't become dislodged. Her hands were still trembling, she could feel them shaking against his too-hot skin, and she knew he could feel it too. As she worked, she became hyper-aware of the items on his nightstand. Prescription bottles, dozens of them, arranged with almost military precision. She'd noticed them before, of course, but had never really looked at them. Now she did. Morphine, lorazepam, haloperidol, medications for pain, for anxiety, for hallucinations. Her eyes scanned the labels, noting dates and dosages, and something struck her as odd. The bottles were too organized, too deliberate, lined up in a pattern that suggested someone was controlling them carefully. Someone who wanted Mr. Alcott sedated, compliant, quiet. Mrs. Collins. The voice came from the doorway, sharp and cold as a blade. Mary Beth spun around so fast she nearly knocked over the floor stand. Abigail Reed stood in the entrance, her nurse's uniform crisp and white, her dark hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her face into a permanent expression of disapproval. She was 40-something, attractive in a severe way, and she'd been caring for Mr. Alcott for the past 18 months. Mary Beth had always found her unsettling. There was something watchful about her, something predatory. "What are you doing in here?" Abigail's voice was calm, controlled, but underneath Mary Beth heard the edge of something dangerous. "You know you're not supposed to be in the patient's room." "I heard footsteps," Mary Beth said, hating how defensive she sounded. "The window was open. I was just snooping where you don't belong." Abigail stepped into the room, her eyes never leaving Mary Beth's face. Or perhaps looking for something valuable? The accusation hung in the air like poison. Mary Beth felt her face flush, felt the letter in her pocket burning against her leg like a brand. "I would never." "Wouldn't you?" Abigail moved closer, and Mary Beth caught a whiff of her perfume, something floral and cloying that made her stomach turn. A widow living in a trailer, barely making ends meet, cleaning houses for pennies. Wouldn't the temptation be there? Wouldn't you think about what's in these drawers, in those cabinets? What a dying man wouldn't miss. Mary Beth wanted to hit her, wanted to scream that she wasn't a thief, that she'd never stolen anything in her life, that the only thing she'd taken was a letter addressed to her own son. A son this house had somehow swallowed up 5 years ago. But she couldn't say any of that. Not without revealing what she knew. Not without putting herself in more danger than she might already be in. "I'm not a thief," she said quietly, forcing herself to meet Abigail's cold stare. "I was doing my job." "Then go do it. Downstairs. Where you belong." It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order, delivered with such authority that Mary Beth found herself backing toward the door, her eyes still locked with Abigail's. But just before she left, she glanced back at Henry Alcott one more time. He was watching her still, those pale eyes filled with something that looked almost like pleading, regret. She couldn't tell. But his right hand, the one not connected to the fore, moved slightly. Just a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but Mary Beth saw it. He was pointing. Toward the closet. Toward something he wanted her to see. Abigail noticed too. She moved quickly, positioning herself between Mary Beth and whatever Henry was trying to indicate. "Get out," she said, and this time there was no pretense of civility. Just naked hostility. Mary Beth fled. She made it to the staircase before her legs gave out, and she sat down hard on the top step, her whole body shaking so violently her teeth chattered. The letter in her pocket felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The look in Henry Alcott's eyes, that desperate, guilty, terrified look, was burned into her brain. And Abigail's hostility, her immediate assumption of theft, the way she'd moved to block Henry's gesture. It all added up to something Mary Beth didn't want to believe but couldn't ignore. This house held secrets, dark ones, and somewhere in its shadows was the truth about what happened to Samuel. As she sat there trying to catch her breath, trying to make sense of the past 15 minutes, she heard it again. Footsteps, heavy ones, moving through the hallway above her, pacing back and forth with deliberate, measured steps. But she'd just left Henry's room, and he couldn't walk. And Abigail was still up there. She'd heard her moving around, adjusting things. So who was walking through the third floor? The floor that was supposed to be empty? The floor that Mrs. Chun said had been closed off for years? Mary Beth stood up on shaking legs, her hand pressed against the wall for support. She looked up toward the ceiling, tracking the sound of those footsteps as they moved from one end of the house to the other. And then abruptly they stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. Mary Beth didn't sleep that night. She lay in her trailer bed, still wearing her cleaning uniform because she was too exhausted to change, staring at the water-stained ceiling while her mind replayed every moment of that morning. The letter sat on her nightstand, unread beyond that first terrible line, glowing in the darkness like something radioactive. She'd tried to read more, had unfolded it 3 times, but each time her hands shook so badly the words blurred into incomprehensible shapes. By 4 a.m., she gave up on sleep entirely and made coffee so strong it tasted like tar, sitting at her tiny kitchen table and watching the letter as if it might suddenly speak on its own. I need to confess the truth before my body gives out completely. What truth? What had Henry Alcott done to her son? The questions circled her mind like vultures, each one bringing a fresh wave of nausea. She thought about calling the police, about marching into Sheriff Morrison's office and demanding answers. But what would she say? That she'd found letters in a dying man's desk? That she'd stolen one? That she had a feeling, just a terrible, bone-deep feeling, that Henry Alcott knew what happened to Samuel? They'd think she was crazy. Or worse, desperate. The grieving mother who'd finally snapped after 5 years of hoping. By the time dawn broke over Maplewood, painting the snow-covered trailer park in shades of gray and pink, Mary Beth had made a decision. She would go back. She would finish her shift as if nothing had happened. And she would find a way to get back into that study, to read the rest of those letters, to piece together whatever twisted story connected a millionaire to her missing son. The mansion looked different in daylight, less menacing, more sad, like a beautiful woman who'd aged badly and knew it. Mary Beth let herself in through the service entrance at exactly 5:47 a.m., her hands steadier now that she had a purpose. The house was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than yesterday. Less watching, more waiting. She moved through her routine mechanically, kitchen counters, dining room floors, the powder room that no one ever used. All the while, her eyes kept drifting to the study door. Still closed, still forbidden. At 7:15 a.m., she heard movement upstairs. Abigail's footsteps, recognizable by their sharp, efficient rhythm, then the sound of water running through old pipes. The house was waking up, and with it, her window of opportunity was closing. Mary Beth set down her mop and moved toward the stairs, her heart already accelerating. She needed to check on Mr. Alcott. It was part of her duties, she told herself, even though she knew it was a lie. What she really needed was to look into those pale eyes again, to see if yesterday's desperation was real or imagined. Henry Alcott's bedroom door was open this time, an invitation or a trap. Mary Beth stepped inside, her shoes silent on the thick carpet. He was awake, propped up on fresh pillows, looking somehow even frilier than yesterday. The morning light streaming through the now-closed window made his skin appear translucent, almost ethereal, as if he was already halfway to becoming a ghost. His eyes found her immediately, and this time there was no mistaking the emotion in them, pure, undiluted fear. "Mr. Alcott," she said softly, approaching the bed. "How are you feeling this morning?" His mouth opened, closed, opened again. His lips moved, but no sound came out except that terrible wheezing. He lifted one skeletal hand. The effort seemed to cost him everything, and pointed toward the nightstand, toward a glass of water. Mary Beth picked it up, held it to his lips, watched his throat work as he took tiny, painful sips. Some of the water dribbled down his chin, and she wiped it away with a tissue, surprised by her own gentleness. This man might have hurt her son, might know terrible things, but he was still dying, still human. "Thank you," he whispered finally, his voice like gravel scraping glass. Then, so quietly she almost missed it, "I tried." Mary Beth's hand froze. "Tried what?" His eyes filled with tears that didn't fall, trapped by dehydration and whatever medication was keeping him sedated. "Tried, but I couldn't." The words dissolved into a coughing fit that shook his entire body. Mary Beth grabbed more tissues, helped him through it, her own heart pounding so hard she felt dizzy. When the coughing finally subsided, he looked at her with such raw anguish it made her stomach twist. "Couldn't what?" she pressed, leaning closer. "Mr. Alcott, please." What are you trying to tell me? But he'd retreated into himself, his eyes going distant, unfocused. She recognized the look. He was slipping into that morphine haze, that chemical fog where pain couldn't follow but neither could coherent thought. Mary Beth wanted to shake him, to drag him back to consciousness, to force him to finish that sentence. Instead, she stood there helplessly, watching him drift away, watching answers slip through her fingers like smoke. Step away from the patient. Abigail's voice cut through the room like a whip crack. Mary Beth jumped, spinning around to find the nurse standing in the doorway, holding a breakfast tray with one hand and a syringe with the other. Her face was a mask of professional disapproval, but her eyes were calculating, assessing, deciding something. He asked for water, Mary Beth stammered. I'm sure he did. Abigail set the tray down on the dresser and moved to the bed with practiced efficiency. But as I told you yesterday, you're not authorized to be in this room. If Mr. Alcott needs something, he has me. Do I need to speak with Mrs. Chun about your boundary issues? The threat was clear. One more complaint and Mary Beth would lose this job, would lose access to this house and whatever secrets it held. She bit back the angry retort, climbing up her throat, and nodded. I understand. I'm sorry. See that you are. Abigail picked up the syringe, tapped it, and approached Henry's foreline. Mr. Alcott needs his rest. Constant interruptions aren't good for his condition. Mary Beth watched as Abigail injected something into the fore, morphine probably, or maybe something stronger. Henry's eyes, which had been tracking their conversation with dim awareness, immediately began to glaze over. Within seconds, he was gone, lost in pharmaceutical oblivion. Too fast, Mary Beth thought. That medication worked too fast, knocked him out too completely. As if Abigail wanted him silenced. You're still here, Abigail observed, not looking at her. Mary Beth left. She made it to the first-floor bathroom before the shaking started again, locking herself in and bracing her hands on the sink while her reflection stared back at her from the mirror. Pale, wild-eyed, terrified. I tried, but I couldn't. What did that mean? Try to do what? Tried to save Samuel? Tried to tell the truth? Tried to die before the guilt consumed him? She splashed cold water on her face, trying to calm down, trying to think clearly. There was something deeply wrong in this house, something beyond an old man dying and a possessive nurse. The way Abigail controlled access to Henry, the way she monitored everything, the perfectly organized medication bottles, the way she'd rushed to sedate him the moment he'd started talking. It all pointed to one terrible conclusion. Abigail was keeping Henry quiet, drugged, compliant. But why? Mary Beth dried her face and stepped back into the hallway, her mind racing. She needed to talk to someone, needed a second opinion, needed. Mary Beth Collins? She nearly screamed. A man stood near the front entrance, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a paramedic's uniform. It took her a moment to place him. Owen Keller, one of the local EMTs. She'd seen him around town, knew he'd responded to calls at the Alcott mansion before. He was in his late 40s, with kind eyes and graying hair, and he was looking at her with concern. Owen, she breathed, one hand pressed to her chest. You scared me. Sorry about that. I'm here for Mr. Alcott's weekly check-in. He glanced around the foyer, then lowered his voice. You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. The kindness in his tone nearly broke her. Mary Beth felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back furiously. I'm fine. Just tired. Long morning. Owen studied her face for a moment too long, and she had the uncomfortable feeling he could see right through her. This house will do that to you, he said finally. Hell of a place to work. Hell of a situation, watching a man waste away like that. How long have you been coming here? Mary Beth asked, desperate to shift focus away from herself. About 2 years. Since Mr. Alcott got really bad. Owen set down his medical bag and leaned against the wall, his voice dropping even lower. You know, there are rumors about him. About why he's sick. Mary Beth's pulse quickened. What kind of rumors? The kind people whisper about in diners and parking lots. That he's not sick from any disease the doctors can name. That he's sick from. Owen paused, choosing his words carefully. From guilt. From eating himself alive with it. My grandmother used to say the body knows what the mind tries to hide. That secrets make you sick from the inside out. The words hit Mary Beth like a physical blow. Guilt. Henry Alcott was dying of guilt. And somehow, impossibly, that guilt was connected to Samuel. She knew it. She felt it in her bones. What would he have to feel guilty about? She asked, trying to sound casual. Owen glanced toward the stairs, making sure they were alone. No one knows for sure. But he changed about 5 years ago, right around the time that Collins kid disappeared. You remember that? Awful thing. Mother's still looking for him, poor woman. Mary Beth's vision swam. Owen didn't know. Didn't recognize her married name versus her maiden name that the news had used. Didn't realize he was talking to that mother. I remember, she whispered. Well, right after that kid vanished, Mr. Alcott disappeared too. For 3 days. When he came back, he was different. Wouldn't leave the house. Wouldn't see anyone. Started getting sick. Some folks say he saw something that night, during that storm. Others say he did something. Either way, it's been killing him ever since. The hallway tilted. Mary Beth grabbed the wall for support, her mind exploding with implications. Henry had disappeared right after Samuel. For 3 days. The same 3 days the police had searched frantically. The same 3 days she'd sat by the phone praying for news. Where had he gone? What had he done? And why did he have letters addressed to Samuel? Mrs. Collins? Abigail's voice, sharp and suspicious, echoed from the top of the stairs. Both Mary Beth and Owen looked up to find her descending, her eyes fixed on them with obvious displeasure. Mr. Keller, she said coldly. You're early. Am I? Owen checked his watch. Right on time, actually. 8 o'clock, like always. Abigail's jaw tightened, but she forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Of course. Mr. Alcott is resting comfortably. Perhaps we should let him sleep a bit longer before the examination. He just got his medication? Owen asked, and Mary Beth heard the subtle accusation in his tone. His morning dose, yes. Seems like he's been getting a lot of morning doses lately. Almost like someone wants him sleeping through these check-ins. The tension between them was palpable, electric. Mary Beth found herself holding her breath, watching this power struggle play out. Abigail's smile turned glacial. I follow doctor's orders, Mr. Keller. Perhaps you should focus on your job and let me focus on mine. Right. Owen picked up his bag. Mrs. Collins, take care of yourself. This house. He looked around at the expensive walls, the crystal chandelier, the marble floors. This house takes pieces of people. Don't let it take too much from you. He headed upstairs, leaving Mary Beth alone with Abigail in the foyer. The nurse watched him go, then turned her cold gaze on Mary Beth. You've been here long enough today, she said quietly. I think it's time you left. Now. It wasn't a suggestion. Mary Beth sat in her car outside the Maplewood diner for 20 minutes before she found the courage to go inside. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles ached, and she could see her breath forming small clouds in the cold air because she'd turned off the engine to save gas. Through the diner's frost-covered windows, she could see Owen Keller sitting in a booth near the back, a cup of coffee steaming in front of him. He'd called her cell phone an hour after she'd left the mansion, his voice low and urgent. We need to talk. Away from that house. Away from her. The letter from Henry's desk lay on the passenger seat, partially unfolded. She'd finally read it, all of it, sitting in the McDonald's parking lot with tears streaming down her face, and her hands shaking so badly she'd nearly torn the delicate paper. The words were burned into her brain now, replaying on an endless loop. I need to confess the truth before my body gives out completely. Samuel Collins came to me that night, terrified, saying he couldn't tell anyone what he'd seen. I should have taken him home. I should have called his mother. But I was afraid of what he knew, afraid of what it meant, afraid of who it would destroy. I made a choice that night that I can never take back. And now I'm paying for it with every breath, with every day that this disease eats me from the inside out. Some guilt you can't swallow. Some guilt swallows you instead. But it ended there. Incomplete. Infuriating. What had Samuel seen? What choice had Henry made? And where was her son now? Mary Beth forced herself out of the car, pulling her thin jacket tighter against the December wind that cut through the parking lot like knives. The diner's bell chimed when she entered, and several locals looked up from their breakfast plates, recognizing her, their expressions shifting to that particular mixture of pity and discomfort that people always wore around the mother of a missing child. She ignored them, walking straight to Owen's booth and sliding into the seat across from him. Thank you for coming, Owen said quietly, pushing a menu toward her. Order something. We need to look normal. Normal, Mary Beth repeated, the word tasting foreign in her mouth. Nothing had been normal for 5 years. She ordered coffee she wouldn't drink and toast she wouldn't eat, and when the waitress, Donna Pierce, who'd gone to high school with Mary Beth's late husband, walked away, she leaned forward. What do you know? Owen glanced around the diner, making sure no one was paying attention, then pulled out his phone. I've been doing Mr. Alcott's weekly check-ins for 2 years, and I've been documenting something that didn't sit right with me. He swiped through photos, medical charts, medication logs, dates and times. Look at this. His decline isn't natural. It's too fast, too aggressive. And the medication regimen Abigail has him on, it's not standard palliative care. It's something else. Mary Beth studied the screen, her limited medical knowledge struggling to make sense of the numbers and abbreviations. What do you mean? I mean she's keeping him sedated, heavily, more than is necessary for pain management. And some of these medications, he zoomed in on one particular chart. They cause cognitive impairment, confusion, memory loss. It's like she wants him unable to communicate clearly. The toast arrived. Neither of them touched it. Mary Beth's mind was racing, connecting dots she didn't want to see. Why would she do that? Owen set down his phone and looked at her with those kind, tired eyes. That's what I need to ask you. Why are you really at that house, Mary Beth? And don't tell me it's just the job. I saw how you looked when I mentioned the Collins case. I saw how you reacted. She should have lied, should have deflected. But she was so tired of carrying this alone, so desperate for someone, anyone, to help her understand. Samuel Collins was my son, she whispered. Is my son? I don't know anymore. Owen's face went pale. Jesus Christ. I found something in Henry's study. Letters. Addressed to Samuel. Written by Henry. She pulled the crumpled letter from her jacket pocket and slid it across the table. Read it. She watched Owen's expression change as he read, shock, confusion, then something darker. Horror. When he finished, he set the letter down carefully, as if it might explode. Mary Beth, this is evidence. You need to take this to the police. Evidence of what? That Henry wrote letters to my missing son. That doesn't prove anything except that he knew Samuel existed. She heard her voice rising and forced it back down. I need more. I need to know what Samuel saw. I need to know what choice Henry made. Her voice broke. I need to know if my son is alive. Owen reached across the table and squeezed her hand, and the simple human contact nearly undid her. She hadn't been touched with kindness in so long she'd forgotten what it felt like. Okay, he said. Okay, then we figure this out together. But we need to be smart about it. Abigail is dangerous. I've seen how she operates, how she controls everything in that house. If she finds out you're digging, she already suspects something. She's been watching me. Then we need to be careful. Owen pulled his hand back and picked up his coffee, his mind clearly working through possibilities. Tell me everything you know about the night Samuel disappeared. Every detail. Mary Beth closed her eyes, forcing herself back to that night she'd relived 1,000 times in therapy, in nightmares, in every quiet moment when her mind had nothing else to occupy it. It was November 15th, 2020. A Thursday. There was a storm coming in. Weather Service had been warning about it all day. Samuel was working late at Anderson's auto garage on the edge of town. He called me around 8 p.m., said he'd be home by 9:30, told me he loved me. Her voice caught on that last detail. He always said he loved me. Every time. Like he knew, like he somehow knew. Did he sound scared? Worried? Different? No. Normal. Maybe a little tired, but normal. Mary Beth opened her eyes, staring at the cold coffee in front of her. The storm hit around 9. Power went out in my trailer. I tried calling him, but the cell towers were down. By midnight, when he still wasn't home, I called the garage. No answer. I got in my car and drove there in the storm. Stupid, dangerous, but I had to. And his car was gone. The garage was locked up. It was like he'd just vanished. Owen was taking notes on his phone now, his paramedic training showing in the way he documented details. And the police investigation? Sheriff Morrison searched for 3 days. They found Samuel's car on Lumberjack Road, about 15 miles outside town, driver's door open, keys still in the ignition. No signs of struggle. No blood. No tracks in the mud because the rain had washed everything away. It was like he'd parked the car and just walked into the woods and disappeared. Mary Beth's hands clenched into fists on the table. They searched those woods for weeks. Dogs, volunteers, helicopters. Nothing. After 6 months, they declared it a cold case. After a year, most people assumed he was dead. But you didn't. A mother knows, Mary Beth said fiercely. I would know if he was dead. I would feel it. He's out there somewhere, Owen. And Henry Alcott knows where. Owen was quiet for a long moment, staring at his notes. Then, you said Samuel's car was found on Lumberjack Road. That's the old logging route, right? Barely anyone uses it anymore. Right. It leads up into the mountains, eventually connects to the highway that goes to Burlington. But there's nothing out there except old logging camps and hunting cabins. And the Alcott family cabin, Owen said quietly. Henry's father built it in the 60s. It's about 20 miles up that road, deep in the woods. Henry used to spend summers there when he was a kid. Mary Beth's heart stopped. How do you know that? My dad worked for the Alcott family in the 80s, did maintenance on their properties. I went up to that cabin a few times as a kid, helped with repairs. It's remote, completely isolated, hasn't been used in years. Owen leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. Mary Beth, what if that's where Henry went? Those 3 days he disappeared after Samuel vanished. What if he went to the cabin? The implications crashed over her like a wave. Samuel's car found on the road that led to the cabin. Henry disappearing for 3 days. The guilt that had eaten him alive ever since. We need to go there, she said immediately. We need to search it. It's December. Those mountain roads are probably impassable with snow. And we'd need... Owen stopped mid-sentence, his eyes widening. Wait. The letters. You said there were more letters in the desk. Dozens of them. All addressed to Samuel. I only took one because I was scared of getting caught. We need to get the rest. They might tell us more, might give us the full story of what happened that night. Owen grabbed her hand again, urgent now. But we can't just walk in and take them. Abigail will notice. We need a distraction, a reason to be in that room without her hovering. Mary Beth's mind raced. Tomorrow night is Mrs. Chen's night off. Abigail usually stays late on those nights to cover the evening care. If we could get her out of the house somehow. I could call in a medical emergency, Owen said. Tell her Mr. Alcott needs to be evaluated at the hospital, that his vitals are concerning. She'd have to go with him in the ambulance. That would give you maybe 30 minutes alone in the house. It was risky, possibly illegal, definitely dangerous. But Mary Beth was past caring about any of that. Her son was out there somewhere, and the answers were in that study. When? She asked. Tomorrow night, 7 p.m. I'll make the call around 6:30, get her out of there. You show up for your evening check, like you sometimes do. Say Mrs. Chen asked you to cover. Once the ambulance leaves, you go straight to the study and get those letters. Mary Beth nodded, her whole body thrumming with purpose and terror. Okay, we do this. Owen squeezed her hand one more time, then let go and sat back, his expression grave. Mary Beth, you need to understand something. If those letters contain what I think they contain, if they prove Henry Alcott was involved in Samuel's disappearance, this becomes a criminal investigation. The police will get involved. Everything will come out. Are you ready for that? She thought about Samuel's room in her trailer, preserved exactly as he'd left it. About 5 years of not knowing, of waking up every morning to the same crushing weight of absence. About the way people looked at her now, with pity, with discomfort, like she was a ghost haunting her own life. I've been ready for 5 years, she said. I just needed to know where to look. They left the diner separately, Mary Beth waiting 5 minutes before walking to her car. The sun was setting over Maplewood, painting the snow-covered streets in shades of orange and purple, beautiful and cold. She sat in her car and looked at the letter again, at Henry's shaking handwriting, at the words that had haunted her since she'd first read them. Some guilt you can't swallow. Some guilt swallows you instead. Hold on, Samuel, she whispered to the empty car, to the frozen air, to wherever her son was in this vast, uncaring world. I'm coming. Just hold on a little longer. The plan fell apart at 6:47 p.m. Mary Beth sat in her car 3 houses down from the Alcott mansion, her phone pressed to her ear, listening to Owen's panicked voice. She's not taking the bait. I called about the vitals, said we needed to bring him in for evaluation, but she's refusing. Says she can handle it herself, that moving him would be too traumatic. Mary Beth, I don't think this is going to work. Her heart sank into her stomach. They'd planned everything so carefully. Too carefully, maybe, because now it was all crumbling, and she had nothing. What do we do? She whispered, watching the mansion's windows glow warm against the darkening sky. I don't know. I can't force her to comply without raising serious red flags. If I push too hard, she'll know something's up. Owen sighed heavily on the other end. Maybe we should wait, try another night when... No. The word came out harder than she intended. I can't wait anymore. Every day Henry gets weaker. Every day those answers might die with him. I'm going in. Mary Beth, that's insane. Abigail is there. She's watching everything. Then I'll be careful. I'll figure something out. She was already opening her car door, cold December air rushing in. I have to try, Owen. You understand that, don't you? A long pause. Then, yeah, I understand. But for God's sake, be careful. If anything feels wrong, you get out. Promise me. I promise. She hung up before he could argue further and walked toward the mansion, her work bag slung over her shoulder, her keys clutched in her sweating palm despite the freezing temperature. The letter from Henry's desk was in her jacket pocket again. She'd started carrying it everywhere, like a talisman or a curse. Her plan was simple. Show up for the evening check she sometimes did. Claim Mrs. Chun had asked her to cover some extra hours. Abigail might be suspicious, but she couldn't prove anything. And maybe if luck was finally on Mary Beth's side for once in 5 godforsaken years, she'd find a moment alone in that study. The service entrance was unlocked. Mary Beth let herself in, calling out softly, "Hello? Mrs. Chun? Abigail?" Her voice echoed through the darkened hallway, and for a moment there was no response. Just the familiar sounds of the old house settling, the hum of the furnace, the tick of the grandfather clock in the foyer. Then footsteps on the floor above, quick and light, and Abigail appeared at the top of the stairs. "Mrs. Collins." The nurse's voice was flat, emotionless. "What are you doing here?" Mrs. Chun called, asked if I could cover some evening hours. Said she needed help with, Mary Beth fumbled for a believable lie, with the laundry and tidying up the guest rooms. Abigail descended the stairs slowly, her eyes never leaving Mary Beth's face. She was wearing her usual crisp white uniform, but there was something different about her tonight. Her hair, normally pulled back in that severe bun, hung loose around her shoulders. And her eyes, usually so controlled, so calculating, looked almost wild. Frightened even. "Mrs. Chun didn't call anyone," she said quietly. "I would know if she had." Mary Beth's mouth went dry. "I must have misunderstood then. I'm sorry, I'll just—" "You're lying." Abigail reached the bottom of the stairs and moved closer, and Mary Beth caught the smell of alcohol on her breath. Wine maybe, or something stronger. "You've been lying since the moment you found those letters. Don't think I don't know. Don't think I haven't been watching every move you make in this house." The admission hung in the air like poison gas. Mary Beth's hand instinctively went to her pocket, to the letter, and Abigail's eyes tracked the movement. "I don't know what you're talking about," Mary Beth said, but her voice betrayed her, shaking with fear and adrenaline. "Yes, you do." Abigail laughed, a brittle, broken sound. "God, I tried to warn you. Tried to get you to leave before you dug too deep. But you just couldn't help yourself, could you? Had to keep pushing, keep searching. Just like that boy of yours." The mention of Samuel made something snap inside Mary Beth. She took a step forward, all fear replaced by sudden, burning rage. "What do you know about my son?" "More than you want me to." Abigail turned away, walking toward the kitchen, and after a moment's hesitation, Mary Beth followed. The nurse poured herself a glass of red wine from an already half-empty bottle on the counter, her hands trembling slightly. Samuel saw something he shouldn't have. Made the mistake of thinking Henry could help him. But Henry... She took a long drink. Henry was too weak to do what needed to be done. Mary Beth felt the world tilting around her. What did Samuel see? Abigail laughed again, that same terrible sound. "Ask Henry." "Oh wait, you can't. I've made sure of that, haven't I? All those helpful medications keeping him nice and quiet, unable to form coherent sentences. Can't confess if you can't talk." The casual cruelty of it, the admission of what she'd been doing, hit Mary Beth like a physical blow. "You're keeping him sedated on purpose, keeping him from telling the truth." "I'm protecting people," Abigail snapped, slamming her wine glass down on the counter. "Protecting them from truths that would destroy everything. You think you want answers? You think knowing will make anything better? It won't. Some doors should stay closed, Mrs. Collins. Some secrets should stay buried. Not when they took my son from me." For a moment, something like pity crossed Abigail's face. Then it hardened again into that cold mask. "Your son made choices. Henry made choices. We all made choices. And now we live with them." She picked up her wine glass and walked past Mary Beth toward the stairs. "Go home, Mrs. Collins. There's nothing for you here but pain." Mary Beth watched her ascend the stairs, watched her disappear into the second-floor hallway, and then she stood alone in the kitchen, her whole body shaking with rage and frustration, and a terrible, crushing sense of being so close yet still so far from the truth. Abigail knew everything. Everything. And she was drunk, loose-lipped, vulnerable. If Mary Beth could just push a little harder, could just find the right angle. A sound from above made her freeze. A door closing. Then another sound, faint but unmistakable, breaking glass. A muffled curse. More sounds of something falling, crashing. Abigail, in her drunken state, was making a mess of something upstairs. This was it. This was her chance. Mary Beth moved quickly to the study, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The door was closed but unlocked. She slipped inside, closing it softly behind her, and went straight to the secretary desk. The hidden drawer was still there, still unlocked from when she'd opened it days ago. She pulled it out with shaking hands, and there they were, the letters. Dozens of them, yellowed and worn, all addressed to Samuel Collins in that same desperate handwriting. She started grabbing them, shoving them into her work bag, not even taking time to count or organize. She just needed them all, needed every piece of evidence before Abigail sobered up or Henry died or whatever fragile window of opportunity she had slammed shut forever. Her hands worked frantically, pulling letter after letter from the drawer, when her fingers brushed against something else. Something cold and metal, hidden beneath the stack. A key. Mary Beth pulled it out, held it up to the dim light filtering through the study windows. It was old, ornate, made of tarnished brass with an elaborate bow. The kind of key that opened something important. Something hidden. She turned it over and found words engraved on one side. 3rd floor, East Wing. The 3rd floor. The floor that was supposed to be closed off. The floor where she'd heard footsteps that first morning. Mary Beth pocketed the key and finished grabbing the letters, her bag now heavy with secrets. She was about to leave when she noticed something else, scratches on the hardwood floor beneath where the desk sat. Deep gouges, as if the desk had been moved repeatedly, dragged away from the wall. She knelt down, running her fingers over the marks, following them to the baseboards. And there, barely visible in the shadows, was a dark stain. Old and faded, but unmistakable. Blood. Someone had bled here. Someone had bled here, and someone had cleaned it up and moved furniture to hide the evidence. Mary Beth's stomach turned over, acid rising in her throat. She forced herself to breathe, to think clearly. The stain was old, years old probably. It might not even be related to Samuel. But the timing, the location, the way Abigail had reacted, it all connected somehow. She stood up, her legs weak, and that's when she heard it. A door opening upstairs. Footsteps. Heavy ones. Not Abigail's quick, efficient steps. These were different. Deliberate. Coming from above, from the 3rd floor, moving across the ceiling directly over her head. The key in her pocket seemed to burn against her leg. Mary Beth left the study, closing the door behind her as quietly as possible, and moved to the main staircase. She could hear Abigail in Henry's room, still making noise, probably changing his bedding or adjusting his medications. The 2nd floor was occupied, but the 3rd floor, she started climbing. Each step felt like a confession, like admitting she'd gone too far, crossed a line she could never uncross. But she'd already crossed so many lines. What was one more? The 2nd floor landing passed beneath her feet. Then the narrow staircase that led to the 3rd floor, dusty, clearly unused, cobwebs stretching across the corners. The footsteps had stopped now, but she could feel something waiting up there. Could feel the weight of secrets pressing down from above. The 3rd floor hallway was dark, lit only by moonlight through grimy windows. Doors lined both sides, all closed, all locked. Except one. The door at the very end of the east wing stood slightly ajar, and from within came a faint glow. Candlelight, maybe. Or a lamp. Mary Beth approached slowly, the key clutched in her sweating palm, even though the door was already open. She pushed it wider, and it swung inward with a long, protesting creak. The room was small, clearly a storage space or servants' quarters from when the house was first built. Old furniture covered in dusty sheets, boxes stacked against walls, and in the center, on a small table, sat a kerosene lamp burning with a steady flame. But what made Mary Beth's breath stop, what made her knees nearly give out, was what lay on top of one of the boxes. A jacket. A child's winter jacket. Navy blue with orange lining. Samuel's jacket. The one he'd been wearing the night he disappeared. Mary Beth stumbled forward, her hands reaching for it before her brain could process what she was doing. She grabbed the jacket, held it to her face, and inhaled. 5 years gone, and it still smelled like him, like motor oil and teenage boy and the cheap cologne he'd bought with his first paycheck. She collapsed to her knees, clutching the jacket, and finally, the tears came. Great heaving sobs that shook her entire body, years of grief and fear and desperate hope all pouring out at once. He'd been here. Samuel had been in this house. And someone had kept his jacket. Hidden it. preserved it like evidence or a trophy, or... The door slammed shut behind her. Mary Beth spun around, still on her knees, still holding the jacket. The doorknob turned, twisted, and she heard the sick click of a lock engaging. She scrambled to her feet, rushed to the door, yanked on the handle. Locked. Completely locked. No, 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 she pounded on the wood, panic flooding her system. Let me out. Abigail. Let me out. Footsteps in the hallway. Slow. Deliberate. Coming closer. Then stopping right outside the door. A voice, cold and empty. Now you've seen too much, Mrs. Collins. Just like your son did. And look what happened to him. The footsteps retreated. Mary Beth screamed, pounded harder, kicked at the door until her feet ached. But the only response was silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. And the kerosene lamp burning steadily in the darkness, casting shadows that looked almost like a boy standing in the corner, watching her with his mother's eyes, asking why she'd taken so long to find him. Mary Beth didn't know how long she'd been locked in that room. Time became meaningless in the darkness, measured only by the gradual dimming of the kerosene lamp and the increasing cold that seeped through the old walls. She'd screamed until her voice gave out, pounded on the door until her hands were bruised and bleeding, searched every corner of the room for another way out. There was none. Just dusty furniture, old boxes, and Samuel's jacket, which she now wore over her own, wrapped around herself like armor or a burial shroud. She tried her phone, no signal on the third floor, the old house's thick walls blocking everything. She tried the window, painted shut decades ago, and overlooking a 3-story drop onto frozen ground. She'd even tried breaking down the door, throwing her full weight against it until her shoulders screamed in protest. Nothing worked. She was trapped, just like Abigail had intended. The letters. At least she still had the letters, stuffed in her work bag that she'd managed to keep with her. Mary Beth sat on the dusty floor, back against the wall, and by the dying light of the lamp, she began to read. Letter after letter, each one a fragment of Henry Alcott's tortured confession, each one pulling her deeper into a nightmare she'd been living for 5 years without knowing its full shape. The first few letters were rambling, guilt-soaked apologies. Henry writing to a boy he'd never send these to, begging forgiveness for choices he couldn't take back. But as Mary Beth read further, details emerged. Names, places, events that had been hidden beneath layers of small-town silence and careful lies. November 15th, 2020. The night everything broke apart. Samuel came running down Lumberjack Road in the storm, flagged down my car like a drowning man grasping for driftwood. He was terrified, Samuel. Your beautiful boy was shaking so hard I thought he might shatter. He said he'd seen something at the old logging warehouse, the one my brother Thomas uses for his business dealings. I should have known better than to ask what, but I did, and Samuel told me. Mary Beth's hands trembled so badly the letter rattled. Thomas Alcott, Henry's older brother. She knew him by reputation only. A businessman who'd left Maplewood 20 years ago for Boston, made a fortune in real estate, only returned for occasional holidays. A man people spoke of with respect and a little fear, though no one could quite say why. He saw Thomas and those men from Burlington, saw what they were doing with those trucks, those shipments that came through in the middle of the night. Samuel worked at Anderson's garage. Of course he'd recognize stolen car parts when he saw them. Recognize a chop shop operation. Recognize something worth killing to keep quiet. The words blurred. Mary Beth wiped her eyes and forced herself to keep reading. Samuel was so scared. Said he'd only gone to the warehouse because his car had broken down on the way home. Thought maybe he could use the phone there to call for help. Instead, he saw everything. And they saw him. Chased him. He ran into the woods, came out on Lumberjack Road, where I was driving home from dinner in Burlington. He begged me to help him. Said he didn't know what to do, that those men would kill him if they found him. Mary Beth's chest felt like it was caving in. Samuel had needed help. Had found someone he thought he could trust. And that trust had destroyed everything. I should have taken him straight to the police. Should have protected him. But Thomas is my brother. My only family left after our parents died. And I knew, God help me, I knew what he was capable of. What he'd do to protect his operation. So I made a choice, Samuel. The wrong choice. I took your boy to the family cabin on Mount Harrison. Told him to hide there while I figured out what to do. Told him I'd come back for him in the morning, that I'd fix everything. I was so stupid. So unforgivably stupid. The lamp flickered, threatening to go out. Mary Beth grabbed another letter, reading faster now, desperate to know how this story ended even though she could feel the tragedy building like a wave about to crash. I went to Thomas that night, confronted him at his hotel in Burlington. We fought, God, we fought like we hadn't since we were children. I told him I knew about the warehouse, about the operation, about Samuel. I told him I was going to the police unless he shut it all down and left town. He laughed at me, said I was too weak, too sentimental, that the boy was a loose end that needed tying up. I told him Samuel was at the cabin, that he was under my protection. That was my second mistake, telling Thomas where to find him. Mary Beth couldn't breathe. The room was spinning, tilting, and she could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears like war drums. Thomas left, said he'd handle it. I knew what that meant. I drove back to the cabin as fast as I could. The storm was so bad, trees coming down on the road, power lines sparking in the darkness. By the time I got there, Thomas's car was already there. And Samuel, your Samuel, he was trying to run again. Thomas had found him, cornered him. They were struggling in the cabin. I saw Thomas raise his hand, saw the gun, and the letter ended there. Just stopped mid-sentence, as if Henry couldn't bring himself to write what came next. Mary Beth grabbed the next letter with shaking hands, nearly tearing the old paper in her desperation. I stopped him, threw myself between them. The gun went off, hit the wall, missed Samuel by inches. In the chaos, Samuel ran, disappeared into the storm before either of us could stop him. Thomas wanted to chase him, to finish what he'd started. I wouldn't let him. We fought again, physically this time. I'm not proud of what I did, but I kept Thomas at that cabin, kept him from pursuing your boy. Kept him there until I was sure Samuel had gotten away. Mary Beth's mind reeled. Samuel had gotten away. Was alive? Had escaped into the storm, and then what? Where had he gone? I spent the next 3 days searching. Drove every road, checked every shelter, asked everyone I could think of without revealing why. But Samuel was gone. Vanished. I thought maybe he'd made it home, or to the police, or somewhere safe. But then I heard your broadcasts on the radio. Heard you begging for information about your missing son. And I knew he hadn't made it anywhere. That the storm or the wilderness or something worse had taken him. No, Mary Beth refused to believe it. If Samuel had gotten away from Thomas, if he'd escaped into the storm, there had to be more to the story. There had to be. She grabbed the next letter, but this one was different. Shorter, written in a shakier hand, as if Henry had been barely conscious while writing it. I was wrong. Samuel did make it somewhere, but not home, not to the police. He made it to a road about 20 miles from the cabin, where a woman found him, half-frozen, delirious, hurt from his fall while running. She took him to a hospital in Burlington. But here's what I only learned later, what Abigail finally confessed to me when I was too sick to do anything about it. Abigail worked at that hospital. She was Thomas's, I don't even know what to call it. His accomplice? His lover? His co-conspirator? She found Samuel there, and she made sure he disappeared. Really disappeared. The lamp went out. Mary Beth sat in complete darkness, the letter clutched in her hands, and screamed, a sound of such pure anguish it seemed to shake the walls themselves. Abigail. Abigail had been involved all along, had taken Samuel from that hospital, had made him vanish, had. Light suddenly flooded the room. The door burst open. Mary Beth scrambled backward, expecting Abigail, expecting violence, expecting the end. But it was Owen Keller who stood in the doorway, his face pale and terrified, holding a crowbar in one hand and his phone, with its flashlight on, in the other. Jesus Christ, Mary Beth. I've been trying to call you for hours. He rushed forward, helped her to her feet. When you didn't answer, I came straight here. Found your car outside and Abigail passed out drunk in the kitchen. What the hell happened? Mary Beth couldn't speak. Could only hand him the letters, watch his face change as he read by the light of his phone, watch him understand what she'd just understood. When he finished, he looked at her with horror and something else. Something that might have been hope. Mary Beth, he said quietly. If Samuel made it to a hospital alive, if Abigail moved him somewhere instead of killing him, then he might still be alive. She might have hidden him, created a false identity, put him somewhere. Where? The word came out as a sob. Where would she put him? It's been 5 years, Owen. 5 years. Even if he was alive then, who knows what she... We find Abigail's records. Her files. She's a nurse. She keeps documentation of everything. If she moved Samuel, if she placed him somewhere, there will be a paper trail. Owen grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. But we need to act fast. If she wakes up and realizes you escaped, realizes you have these letters. A sound from downstairs. A door slamming. Then Abigail's voice, no longer drunk slurred but sharp and alert. Where is she? Where the hell is she? Owen and Mary Beth looked at each other, and she saw her own fear reflected in his eyes. They ran, down the servants' staircase at the back of the house, the one Owen had used to reach the third floor. Behind them, Abigail's footsteps thundered up the main stairs. They burst out of a service exit into the freezing December night, ran to Owen's truck parked on the street, and threw themselves inside. He started the engine, pulled away from the curb with tires spinning on ice, and Mary Beth looked back to see Abigail standing in the mansion's doorway, illuminated by the hallway light, her face twisted with rage. She's going to run, Mary Beth said. She knows we have the letters, knows we know everything. She's going to disappear. Not if we get to the police first. Owen drove faster than was safe on the snow-covered roads, his jaw set with determination. Not if we tell them everything before she can destroy the evidence. Mary Beth clutched Samuel's jacket to her chest and the letters to her lap, her son's jacket that smelled like memory and loss, and words that might lead her to him. After 5 years of darkness, there was finally light. Fractured, terrible light that illuminated a truth she wished didn't exist. But light nonetheless. Hold on, Samuel, she whispered again into the frozen night. I'm so close now. Just hold on. Sheriff Morrison looked older than Mary Beth remembered. The years had carved deeper lines around his eyes, and his hair, once salt and pepper, had gone completely gray. He sat across from her in the cramped interrogation room at the Maplewood Police Department, the letters spread across the table between them like accusations, while Owen stood by the door and a younger deputy took notes. It was 11:47 p.m. They'd been here for 3 hours, and Mary Beth had told her story so many times her voice had gone hoarse. Mrs. Collins, Morrison said carefully, picking up one of Henry's letters with latex-gloved hands. I want to believe you. I do. But what you're describing is a conspiracy involving one of the most prominent families in Vermont, a registered nurse with a spotless record, and a criminal operation that we have no evidence ever existed. The letters are evidence, Mary Beth said, her frustration bleeding through exhaustion. Henry confesses to everything. Henry Alcott is dying and heavily medicated. His mental state is questionable at best. A defense attorney would rip these apart in 30 seconds. Morrison set the letter down and rubbed his face. And even if we accept everything written here as truth, it doesn't tell us where Samuel is now. Just that he might have survived that night 5 years ago. Then we question Abigail Reed. Owen interjected from his position by the door. Bring her in, make her tell us what she did with Samuel. She's involved, the letters make that clear. Based on one mention in a letter written by a man who's had enough morphine pumped through him to kill a horse. Morrison shook his head. I need more than that to bring in a citizen for questioning. I need evidence. Real evidence. Mary Beth wanted to scream. Wanted to flip the table and shake Morrison until he understood that every second they wasted was another second Samuel was lost. Another second Abigail had to cover her tracks. But she forced herself to stay calm, to think. Henry Alcott, she said. He's the key. If we can get him lucid, even for a few minutes, get him to confirm what's in these letters. He's in no condition to give a statement, Morrison said. I spoke to his physician this afternoon for an unrelated matter. Dr. Winters says Alcott is barely conscious most days, that we're looking at weeks at most before. Then we don't have weeks. Mary Beth stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the linoleum floor. Sheriff, I am begging you. My son is out there somewhere. For 5 years I've lived in hell not knowing if he's alive or dead, and now I finally have proof that he might be alive, that someone knows where he is. You can't just sit here and tell me there's nothing you can do. Morrison's expression softened, and for a moment she saw the man who'd stood on her trailer steps 5 years ago delivering the worst news of her life. I'm not saying there's nothing I can do. I'm saying we need to be smart about this. If Abigail Reed is involved, if she's been hiding Samuel for 5 years, then she's dangerous. And if we spook her before we have enough evidence, she'll disappear and we'll never find either of them. She already knows we have the letters, Owen said. She saw Mary Beth escape the mansion. She knows we're here, which is why I've already put out an alert for her vehicle and sent deputies to watch the mansion. Morrison pulled out his phone and showed them a text exchange. Abigail Reed's car is still parked at the Alcott residence. She hasn't left. Either she's still inside or she fled on foot, which in this weather seems unlikely. Mary Beth's heart rate spiked. She's still there? With Henry? 2 deputies are posted outside. If she tries to leave, they'll stop her. If she tries anything inside. Morrison trailed off, but the implication was clear. A dying man and a desperate woman trapped in a mansion together. Nothing good could come from that. We need to go back, Mary Beth said. Now, before she does something to Henry. Absolutely not. You two have done enough. This is police business now. Morrison stood, gathering the letters carefully. You're going to go home, stay by your phones, and let us handle this. That's not a request. But Mary Beth was already moving toward the door. Owen caught her arm, and she saw in his eyes that he understood. Understood that she couldn't just sit and wait. Couldn't let this opportunity slip through her fingers like everything else had for 5 years. Morrison called after them, his voice sharp with authority. But they were already out of the interrogation room, through the bullpen where tired deputies looked up from their computers, and out into the parking lot where Owen's truck sat covered in a fresh layer of snow. This is insane, Owen said as he started the engine, but he was already pulling out of the parking lot, already heading toward the mansion. If Morrison finds out we went back there, I don't care. Mary Beth buckled her seatbelt with shaking hands. Henry is dying. If Abigail gets to him first, if she silences him permanently, then Samuel is gone forever. I can't let that happen. I won't. The drive to the mansion took 7 minutes that felt like 7 hours. The streets were empty, the town asleep, only the occasional Christmas lights still twinkling in windows as they passed. When they pulled up to the Alcott mansion, Mary Beth's breath caught. The squad car that should have been parked outside was gone. The mansion sat dark except for one window on the 2nd floor, Henry's room, which glowed with a sickly yellow light. Where are the deputies? Owen's voice was tight with worry. I don't know, but we're going in. Mary Beth was out of the truck before he could argue, running up the snow-covered driveway, her boots slipping on ice. The front door was unlocked, a bad sign. She burst into the foyer, and the smell hit her immediately. Something chemical and wrong, mixed with the now familiar scent of decay and medication. Abigail, she called out, her voice echoing through the empty mansion. Abigail. No response. Just the grandfather clock ticking, and the sound of wind rattling old windows. Owen appeared beside her, breathing hard, his phone already dialing 911. They moved together up the stairs, toward that glowing window, toward Henry Alcott's room. The door was open. Inside, the scene was surreal, nightmarish. Henry lay in his bed, propped on pillows, his eyes open and surprisingly clear, clearer than Mary Beth had ever seen them. Next to the bed stood Abigail, still in her uniform, holding an empty syringe in one hand. But it was her face that terrified Mary Beth. It was completely blank. No emotion. No fear. Nothing. Like she'd already made peace with whatever she was about to do. Abigail, step away from him, Owen said, keeping his voice calm and level. We don't want anyone to get hurt. Too late for that, Abigail said softly. It's been too late for 5 years. She looked at the syringe in her hand, almost surprised to find it there. I gave him something, to counteract the sedatives. He has maybe 10 minutes of clarity before his heart gives out from the strain. I thought he deserved that much. To say what he needs to say. Mary Beth moved closer to the bed, her eyes locked on Henry's face. He was trying to speak, his lips moving soundlessly, his pale eyes fixed on her with terrible intensity. She knelt beside him, took his skeletal hand in hers. Mr. Alcott. Henry. Please. Tell me where Samuel is. His hand squeezed hers weakly. His mouth worked, and finally sound came, a whisper so faint she had to lean in close to hear. Portland, he breathed. Oregon. Abigail, she gave him to a family. The Mitchells. Changed his name to Daniel. Daniel Mitchell. The words exploded in Mary Beth's brain like fireworks. Portland. Oregon. Daniel Mitchell. Her son was alive. After 5 years of not knowing, of believing the worst, of living in that terrible limbo between hope and despair, he was alive. She felt tears streaming down her face, felt her whole body shaking with the weight of it. Why? She asked, her voice breaking. Why would you let her do that? Henry's eyes filled with tears that finally fell, cutting tracks through the papery skin of his face. I couldn't stop Thomas without exposing everything. Samuel saw too much, knew too much. Thomas wanted him dead. Abigail convinced me, said she could make him disappear instead. Give him a new life, new identity. Keep him safe from Thomas. He coughed wetly. I thought I was saving him, but I was just too much of a coward to do it right. "You destroyed my life," Mary Beth said, the words coming out harsh and raw. "You took my son from me. 5 years. 5 years I've been living in hell." "I know." Henry's grip on her hand tightened with surprising strength. "I know, and I've been dying from the guilt, from the knowing. Every day, every breath has been punishment. But not enough. Never enough." His eyes shifted to Abigail, who stood motionless by the window. "She kept him alive. She saved him when I was too weak to. When Thomas would have killed him." Mary Beth looked at Abigail, and for the first time she saw the woman clearly. Not as a villain, not as a monster, but as someone who'd made impossible choices in an impossible situation. "You could have told me," Mary Beth said. "You could have let me know he was alive. And risk Thomas finding out?" Abigail's voice was hollow. "Risk him tracking Samuel down and finishing what he started? I made a choice, Mrs. Collins. Maybe the wrong choice. Probably the wrong choice. But I kept your son breathing. I kept him safe. And I've lived with that weight every single day since." Henry's breathing changed, becoming rapid and shallow. His hand went slack in Mary Beth's grip. "The documents," he gasped. "In my safe, behind the painting, in the study. Everything about Samuel's placement. About Daniel Mitchell. About the family. It's all there. Take it. Find him. Tell him." His eyes closed briefly, opened again with great effort. "Tell him I'm sorry. Tell him some mistakes can't be forgiven. Can only be confessed." His final word came out as barely more than a breath. "Forgive." Then he was gone. The monitors attached to him flatlined, emitting a steady, terrible tone that seemed to fill the entire mansion. Mary Beth sat there holding his hand, this man who'd destroyed her life and saved her son, feeling a complicated tangle of hatred and gratitude that she'd spend the rest of her life trying to unravel. Abigail reached over and turned off the monitors, her movements mechanical. "I'll stay here until the authorities arrive," she said quietly. "I'll tell them everything. All of it. Thomas Alcott, the warehouse operation, what I did with Samuel. I'm done running." Owen had his phone out, was talking rapidly to 911, giving them the address, explaining the situation. But Mary Beth barely heard him. She stood on shaking legs and moved to the study, to the painting Henry had mentioned, a portrait of his father that hung behind the desk. She pulled it down, found the safe behind it, and using Henry's dying strength and clarity as a guide, worked through possible combinations until it clicked open. Inside was a manila envelope, thick with documents. She pulled it out with trembling hands and opened it. There on top was a photograph, a boy maybe 13 years old, standing in front of a house with a woman and man who must be the Mitchells. The boy had grown taller, his features had changed with adolescence, but Mary Beth would know those eyes anywhere. Samuel's eyes. Her son's eyes, looking at the camera with an expression she couldn't quite read. He was alive. He was alive, and he had a name, and he had an address, and she could find him. Mary Beth pressed the photograph to her chest and wept, great, heaving sobs that came from a place so deep she hadn't known it existed. 5 years of grief poured out of her in that moment, mixed with joy and rage and relief and horror all tangled together into something too big to name. Behind her, sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Morrison would be furious. There would be questions, investigations, complications she couldn't even begin to imagine. But none of that mattered, because tomorrow morning she would get on a plane to Portland, and she would find her son. The flight from Burlington to Portland took 6 hours with a layover in Chicago, but to Mary Beth it felt like 6 lifetimes. She sat in the middle seat of economy class, clutching the manila envelope to her chest like it might evaporate if she loosened her grip, while strangers slept on either side of her, and the plane cut through clouds 30,000 feet above a country that suddenly felt different. Smaller, more navigable, because somewhere at the end of this journey was Samuel. She hadn't slept in 48 hours. After the police had swarmed the Alcott mansion, after Morrison had alternately yelled at her and hugged her, after Abigail had been taken away in handcuffs with that same blank expression on her face, after Henry's body had been removed by the coroner, Mary Beth had gone home to her trailer, packed a single bag, and used what little savings she had left to buy a one-way ticket to Portland. Owen had driven her to the airport at 5 a.m., had made her promise to call him the moment she found Samuel, had told her she was the bravest person he'd ever met. She didn't feel brave. She felt terrified. The documents in the envelope told a story that was both heartbreaking and surreal. Abigail had placed Samuel, injured, traumatized, but alive, with a family she'd known from her previous work in Burlington. The Mitchells, Karen and Robert, a couple in their early 40s who'd been trying to adopt for years, but kept getting passed over because of their age. They'd moved to Portland in 2021 for Robert's job at Intel, and Abigail had convinced them that Samuel was a troubled teen from an abusive home who needed to disappear from the system. She'd created false documentation, changed his name to Daniel Mitchell, erased every trace of Samuel Collins from his official existence. The psychological evaluation included in the file, conducted by a therapist Abigail had paid off, reported that Daniel had selective amnesia from trauma, couldn't remember his life before the accident that had left him wandering in the Vermont wilderness. The Mitchells had accepted this, had taken him in with love and patience, had never questioned too deeply because they wanted so badly to believe they were saving a child who needed saving. And in a twisted way they had been. Because if Samuel had gone home, if he'd testified against Thomas Alcott, if he'd stayed in Vermont, Thomas would have found him, would have finished what he'd started. Abigail's terrible choice had kept him breathing. But it had also stolen 5 years from Mary Beth. 5 years of birthdays and Christmases, of high school graduation and first job and all the small moments that make up a life. 5 years of her son living under a different name, with different parents, believing a lie that kept him safe but severed every connection to who he'd been before. The plane landed at PDX at 2:37 p.m. Pacific Time. Mary Beth stumbled through the airport in a daze, rented a car with a credit card that was already maxed out, and drove through Portland's rain-soaked streets with the address from the documents typed into her phone's GPS. The city was beautiful in that gray, melancholic way of the Pacific Northwest. Green everywhere despite December, mountains visible in the distance when the clouds parted, coffee shops on every corner. Samuel had lived here for 4 years, had walked these streets, had built a new life in this place that was as far from Vermont as he could get without falling into the ocean. The Mitchell house was in a quiet suburb called Lake Oswego, about 20 minutes south of downtown. It was a modest 2-story with blue siding and a well-maintained lawn, a basketball hoop in the driveway, and a Honda Civic parked on the street. Completely normal. Completely ordinary. The kind of house where nothing terrible ever happened, where families ate dinner together and argued about homework and worried about normal things like college applications and part-time jobs. Mary Beth sat in her rental car across the street for 30 minutes, watching the house, trying to breathe, trying to prepare herself for a moment she'd imagined 10,000 different ways. What would she say? How would he react? Would he even remember her? The evaluation had said selective amnesia, but was that real or just part of the lie? Did he know, somewhere deep down, that his life was built on someone else's tragedy? At 3:45 p.m., the front door opened. A woman came out, Karen Mitchell. Mary Beth recognized her from photos in the file. Late 40s, kind face, wearing yoga pants and a fleece jacket. She got into the Honda and drove away, probably running errands. The house sat quiet for another 15 minutes. Then the door opened again, and there he was. Mary Beth's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a sob. Samuel Daniel, whoever he was now, stepped out onto the porch in jeans and a Portland Trail Blazers hoodie, carrying a basketball. He was taller than she remembered, broader in the shoulders. His face had lost its boyish softness and taken on the angular features of young manhood. He'd be 24 now, she realized. Not the 19-year-old who'd disappeared, but a man. An adult who'd lived an entire life she knew nothing about. But his eyes. God, his eyes were the same. Even from across the street, even through the gray December drizzle, she could see those eyes that looked exactly like her late husband's, dark brown, deep-set, thoughtful. The eyes she'd stared into the day he was born, when the nurse had placed him in her arms and she'd thought her heart might explode from love. He dribbled the basketball a few times, took a shot at the hoop, missed. Made a face that was so quintessentially Samuel, that little frustrated grimace he'd always made when things didn't go right, that Mary Beth felt something break open inside her chest. She opened the car door before she could think, before fear could stop her, and stepped out into the rain. Samuel, Daniel, noticed her immediately. Noticed the way she stood frozen on the sidewalk across the street, staring at him with an intensity that must have been unsettling. He caught the basketball, held it against his hip, and frowned. "Can I help you?" he called out, polite but wary. Mary Beth couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't do anything but stand there and drink in the sight of him, alive, healthy, real. After 5 years of searching, of hoping, of living in that terrible space between grief and faith, here he was. Her son, her Samuel. "Ma'am." He took a step toward the street, concern replacing wariness on his face. "Are you okay?" She forced her feet to move, crossing the street on legs that felt disconnected from her body. As she got closer, she could see more details. A small scar above his left eyebrow that hadn't been there before, the slight changes in his face that time and trauma had carved. He watched her approach with growing unease, and when she stopped about 10 feet away, he set down the basketball and held up his hands in a gesture that was half defensive, half placating. "Look, if you're lost or need directions." "Samuel." The name came out as a whisper, but it cut through the rain and the distance like a knife. She saw him flinch, saw something flicker across his face. Recognition? Confusion? Fear? And then his expression shuttered closed. "I think you have the wrong person. My name is Daniel." "No." Mary Beth took another step closer, tears streaming down her face, mixing with the rain. "Your name is Samuel Collins. You're from Maplewood, Vermont. You disappeared 5 years ago during a storm on November 15th, 2020. You worked at Anderson's Auto Garage. Your favorite food was my homemade lasagna. You had a Celtics poster in your room, and you always told me you loved me before hanging up the phone." With each detail, she watched his face change. The careful mask cracking, uncertainty seeping through. His hand went to his temple, rubbing it like he had a headache. I don't know what you're talking about." But his voice shook when he said it. Mary Beth pulled out the photograph she'd been carrying, the one she'd found in Henry's safe, but underneath it, her own photo, creased and worn from 5 years of being carried in her wallet. Samuel at 18, standing next to her at his high school graduation, both of them grinning at the camera. She held it out to him with trembling hands. He stared at it for a long moment, and she watched something extraordinary happen. His face went pale. His breathing quickened. His eyes, those beautiful, familiar eyes, filled with tears. He seemed shocked to be crying. "I know this picture," he whispered. "I've seen it. In dreams. I don't know. But I know it. Because it's real, Samuel. You're real. And I'm your mother." Mary Beth's voice broke completely. "I'm your mother, and I've been looking for you for 5 years, and I never stopped believing you were alive somewhere. Never stopped hoping. Never stopped loving you." He looked up from the photograph to her face, really looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. A door opening after being locked for too long. "I remember." His voice was barely audible. "I remember a trailer. With a blue door. And a woman who sang while she cooked. Old country songs that she said were from her grandmother." Mary Beth let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Patsy Cline. You used to complain that they were too old-fashioned. And there was a storm. I was running. Someone was chasing me, and I was so scared, and I found." His hands were shaking now, the photograph trembling between his fingers. "I found a car on the road. A man. He said he'd help me. He said." Samuel's face crumpled, and suddenly he wasn't a 24-year-old man anymore, but a 19-year-old boy who'd been terrified and lost and stolen from everything he knew. "He said he'd take me home. But he didn't," Mary Beth said softly. "He made a choice. A terrible choice. And you ended up here, with the Mitchells, with a new name and a new life. And I'm not here to take that away from you, Samuel. I'm just here to tell you the truth. To tell you that you're loved. That you always were loved. That I never gave up on you." For a moment, they just stood there in the rain, mother and son separated by 5 years and 1,000 miles and secrets that had nearly destroyed them both. Then Samuel took a step forward, then another. And then he was hugging her. This man who was her little boy, this stranger who was her son. And they were both crying and holding on to each other like if they let go, reality might tear them apart again. "I'm sorry," he kept saying into her shoulder. "I'm so sorry I didn't remember. I'm sorry I didn't come home." "Shoo," Mary Beth whispered, running her hand through his hair like she used to when he was small. "You have nothing to be sorry for. Nothing. You survived, Samuel. That's all that matters. You survived." They stood like that for a long time, while the rain fell and the world moved on around them, indifferent to their reunion. Eventually they separated, both wiping their faces, both laughing a little at the absurdity of it all. Samuel led her inside, into the house that had been his home for 4 years, where pictures of him as Daniel Mitchell hung on the walls and participation trophies from community college basketball sat on shelves. They sat at the kitchen table, and Mary Beth told him everything. Every detail of what had happened that night, what Henry and Abigail had done, why he'd been hidden away. She told him about Thomas Alcott, now under FBI investigation for the warehouse operation. She told him about the 5 years she'd spent searching, the way the town had given up hope, the way she'd refused to. And Samuel, because she would always think of him as Samuel, even if he chose to keep the name Daniel, listened with his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, his face cycling through shock and anger and grief and something that might have been relief. "The Mitchells," he said finally. "They saved my life. They took me in when I had nothing, no memory, nowhere to go. They're my parents now, too." "I know," Mary Beth said, and meant it. "I'm not here to take you away from them. I'm here to give you back the pieces of yourself that were stolen. What you do with those pieces, that's up to you." He nodded slowly, processing everything. Then he reached across the table and took her hand, and the gesture was so familiar, so perfectly Samuel, that Mary Beth felt her heart break and heal simultaneously. "I want to know everything," he said. "About my dad, about Maplewood, about who I was before. I want both lives. Is that even possible?" "I don't know," Mary Beth admitted, "but we'll figure it out together, however long it takes. Whatever it looks like. I've got time now. I've got all the time in the world." When Karen Mitchell came home an hour later, arms full of groceries, she found them still at the kitchen table, still talking, still rebuilding a connection that had been severed but never truly broken. The conversation that followed was difficult, Karen crying, demanding to know if Abigail had lied about everything, asking if Samuel would be taken from them. But eventually they reached an understanding. Samuel had 2 mothers now, 2 families, 2 lives that needed to be woven together somehow. It wouldn't be easy. There would be legal complications, therapy, painful conversations, and difficult adjustments. But as Mary Beth sat in that kitchen in Lake Oswego, Oregon, watching her son laugh at something Karen said, seeing him alive and whole and real, she knew that every moment of the past 5 years, every tear and sleepless night and desperate prayer had been worth it. Because the truth had a cost. It had nearly killed Henry Alcott, had sent Abigail to prison, had exposed corruption and crime and terrible choices made by people who thought they were doing the right thing. But the truth also had power. The power to heal. The power to reunite. The power to give back what had been stolen. Some guilt you couldn't swallow. Some guilt swallowed you instead. But some love was stronger than guilt, stronger than lies, stronger than 5 years of distance and deception. And that love had brought her son home. The end. Sometimes the choices we make to protect the people we love end up destroying them in ways we never imagined. Henry Alcott thought he was saving Samuel by hiding him away. Abigail Reed believed she was choosing life over death when she erased a boy's identity and gave him to strangers. But what about Mary Beth, who spent 5 years in a hell of not knowing, who lived every single day in that unbearable space between hope and despair? What about Samuel himself, who lost 5 years of his real life, who grew into adulthood believing a lie about who he was? Were these choices mercy or cruelty? Were they salvation or just another form of violence? And if you were Mary Beth, could you forgive the people who stole your son while claiming they were saving him? Could you look into the eyes of the man who let you suffer for 5 years and hold his hand as he died, accepting that his guilt was its own kind of punishment? This story reminds us that truth has a price, but lies cost even more. That secrets don't just hide in the dark. They grow there, becoming monsters that eventually consume everyone they touch. That guilt is a disease more devastating than any diagnosis a doctor can give. And most importantly, that a mother's love is the most relentless force in the universe. It doesn't give up. It doesn't forget. It searches through darkness until it finds light, no matter how long that takes, no matter what it costs. Mary Beth Collins lost 5 years, but she never lost faith. And in the end, that faith brought her son home. What would you have done in her place? Would you have had the strength to keep searching when everyone else had given up? Would you have forgiven the people who caused your suffering, or would the anger have consumed you? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, if it made you think about the power of truth and the weight of the choices we make, please follow this channel, hit that like button, and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Because some stories aren't just meant to entertain. They're meant to remind us what it means to be human.